we're going to transition now to the Q&A section. Audience members, please raise your hand, and I will pass the microphone to you, and I'll start with you now.
Sorry. Thank you. So the question that I have is regarding cybersecurity insurance. Is definitely a complicated item that school districts have to manage. Based on all the research that I have seen, there's a significant risk that the industry could go affordability issues, and the cost of cybersecurity pretty expensive. So I believe as a school district, we have to manage the risk and ensure that it's affordable. Right. The question I have for the panel, if you can answer this question, where in the industry is going for affordability and having a insurance policy that truly cover risks, for school districts. Because now I've seen a lot of them that just water down some of them, but they're pretty expensive too at the same time.
Yeah. So I've been seeing that you're right. There's an uptick in premiums for cyber insurance, and there's also probably a scaling back of what's getting paid for. If there is a breach, they're only paying for the services for when they're doing the investigations, and not so much a lot of the other stuff. So you really have to kind of balance what you really want to pay for. If you really I like to tell people to put more preventive measures in place. I mean, that's not a preventive. It's really just a piece of paper saying if you have to pay for any services, we'll pay for some of it. I think you have to take that mentality when you look at cyber insurance. It's just an added layer of financial help at the end of all this. I mean, what's it really doing in the end? What's it doing for you? Is it providing you with people to come in and do the controls in your district? Is it writing policies for you? You really have to balance what your district wants to do. And we like to talk about these controls that happen in NIST, in the cybersecurity framework, that are controls that you could prevent even having to try to get to that cybersecurity insurance. Maybe it's not the answer you're looking for, but yes, premiums are going up, and less is probably going to be paid out. And again, I say that again. But it's really more worth it to put your resources towards the front end of things than those back end of things.
Yeah, I know we work with a cybersecurity insurance person as well. Plus, I also have a relationship with New York Schools Insurance Reciprocal, which is probably from most public schools, and it is a constricting market. So they are rewriting their policies, but it's also a litmus test for us as auditors. If you can't get insurance, cybersecurity insurance, that means you're missing something, some major internal control. So I think you do need to have some level of cybersecurity insurance. As Joe was saying, you have to balance, what am I really getting? It's like any insurance that you're paying for. What kind of bang for the buck am I getting? Am I doing enough in here? Do I have a team? Do I have the right resources? To really put an incident response plan, and in fact, keep that business continuity to really, keep us up and running and to prevent, any kind of potential risk that's out there. You can't stop it all. You're not going to be able to prevent everything, but you're doing everything that you can to minimize that risk. Also, having insurance does transfer some of your responsibility, does transfer some of the risk to the school from a financial perspective, so that at least they could be made whole. It's no fun when you see some of the local schools that were in the paper in the past couple of years when they had a breach and then they had to pay money and the community doesn't like it. So you have to, again, weigh those pros and cons.
And when you look at insurance is all about risk, right? So if you have things in place, you give your broker the ability to go back to the insurance company and say, okay, you're charging my client $90,000, but the district has all of these steps in place to protect them compared to these other districts. They shouldn't be held at the same risk level as these other districts, and maybe drive that cost down.
And definitely shop around. I mean, there's a lot of insurers out there that offer cyber insurance, and if you are doing the front end stuff, as Dave said and as Jerry said, the premiums are going to go down.
Well, we've introduced many of you who have been with us for other info sessions in the past to Rob Takarszewski. He's with USI Insurance. We're happy to make that introduction again. He's been a panelist before. We've had several other insurance companies who speak about insuring districts and other school private organizations. So we're happy to make those introductions. But as David and Sherry and Joe mentioned, there are certainly ways to make that more affordable.
And just to add to that, if you don't have multi-factor authentication and proof that you've trained all of the staff that has access to personally identifiable information, you won't get insurance. They won't insure you. And a lot of the questions they ask you are yes and no. So if you say, I have multi-factor authentication, they're assuming everybody has it who has access. So then if you didn't give it to someone in transportation, they're not using multi-factor, and that's where the breach is, you probably wouldn't get covered under your policy. So you have to be really careful about what you're committing to in the questionnaire, and you have to at least make sure you've had done at least the MFA and the training to start, or they really won't insure you. Because it's true, they thought they're losing too much money on schools. Some of them are dropping education completely.
Yeah, we've seen that.
Yeah, they just said, we don't cover education anymore, sorry. Because it's not lucrative. You know, there's a, you know, they end up paying out, especially if someone doesn't pay the ransom. It costs them more. So, you know, just be very careful when you answer a questionnaire and make sure you have started, if you haven't implemented multi-factor authentication yet, get going. You need it. It's one of your best defenses.
Thank you, Laura.
Right. And when you're doing those questionnaires, you know, reach out to someone who has experience with them to help you answer those questions. If you put down something, as Laura said, and it's not something, they're not going to pay you out. You're going to be paying these premiums for nothing.
Okay, audience members, when I hand you the mic, please just identify yourself, introduce yourself, and the district or organization you're with.
Yes, my name is Bob Vecchio. I'm the Executive Director for the Nassau-Suffolk School Boards Association, so I represent those suffering school board members who Newsday will come calling saying, why didn't you do this, that, or the other thing? One thing regarding cyber insurance, you know, the expression that I like to use and impart on board members all the time is it's expensive to be cheap. So make sure that you're proposing to the governance team what is the value for the cyber insurance. But my question, and I guess it's more for the internal auditors or the legal side, what are the things that need to be preserved immediately after an incident to preserve and protect your possible claim that you may have with your cyber insurance company to make sure you recoup, or what are the things not to do to make sure a claim doesn't get disqualified, either or?
I'll defer to Sherry first.
Well, yeah, that's great. That is a really great question, and I'm trying to think, like, what has to be preserved first?
Well, the short answer is everything.
Yeah, I mean, that's really a difficult question. I guess normally when we talk about disaster recovery, what's the first application that's going to be recovered? And it's usually on the financial system, and it's almost always payroll. So something to do with that. I would say, you know, it depends where the breach is and what they're going after.
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing, smaller picture, right? Once you become aware that there has been some sort of breach of your system, the first bit of information I want, anything and everything I have about what the breach was, how did I discover it, the chain of communication, how was that communicated to people? So presumably the breach is discovered by, let's say, our internal IT department, and it's communicated to the district administration. Then from there, it's probably communicated to the board, and then probably lawyers. But you want to keep track of where did information go, when did it go, to whom did it go, and what was next. What, if anything, did you do? You really want to have a timeline of how did you respond to this. That's shorter picture, just related to the breach itself, right? Then you want bigger picture, okay, what you need to find out what was compromised. And yeah, you need to start preserving anything and everything. The most sensitive material is the stuff that you start with. You know, and one of the things that hasn't been mentioned, but I know I have mentioned to other districts or entities I've spoken to, is I know at schools, right, almost everybody keeps hard copies of things too. So one of the things hard copies are designed to do now, they're your backup, right? If we have compromised payroll information, but I have the printed payroll, that can be your backup, at least in the short term. So you want, you know, you're looking when you get to the bigger piece of this, okay, what's been compromised? Let me deal with the most sensitive information I have on the system and lock that down. And that needs to, by the way, all of this is done within an hour, 2 hours. I mean, you're doing this immediately. But I mean, like I said, I mean, somewhat facetiously, the answer is everything. Because in the school, everything is sensitive. I mean,
So that's why it's important to do the data classification. You have to understand what kind of data you have and, what kind of sensitivity levels there are, in order to understand, what you've been compromised about.
I'm just going to throw this, I hate to put him on the spot, but we have from Stetson our incident response and digital forensics expert, Joe Wagner, in the back. So he can probably give you a very detailed response on this one.
Without getting too crazy, one of the big things we see when doing investigations is evidence is not retained when it's supposed to be. And sometimes we have to revert to backups, even corrupted backups during an investigation. But yeah, one of the biggest things is IT wants to get you back up and running as fast as possible. Insurance, and if it gets even further than that, if you need disclosures, if you need to really see exactly what happened and how it happened and get that timeline, that play-by-play that the attacker took when they got on the system, how long they were on the system, and what they took from that system, you're going to need images of all those machines. So before IT comes in and just wipes everything and just starts the restore process, make sure there's at least a backup, make sure there's something that an investigation can be done. Even if it doesn't satisfy like a tier of we know everything was breached, if you suspect that an intruder has been in or has a foothold on the system for any length of time, retain that information, make sure you get a good copy. A forensic image is the best. If you can't do that, at least make sure you have a backup, retain that, put that off to the side, and then let IT do the recovery process. But yeah, we see that all the time. It makes the entire case and even the disclosure part so much more difficult.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Question?
Thank you. Gary Zimmerman with the Suffolk Regional Information Center, Eastern Suffolk BOTES. This is more of a comment back to the order of who you call and when if you have a breach. Again, this is probably more pertaining to the Suffolk County districts, but if Nassau does things the same way, it's working. The Regional Information Center most likely houses a lot of your data. Most of you have your financial systems with us, you have your student management systems with us, we have backups for you. Please, if you suspect you've had a breach, make us one of your first phone calls, because you all have active network connections to us. So if you get a malware and you get your ransomware to your district and all of your data is encrypted, if you call us quickly enough, we will have copies of that data before it can get encrypted as well. So again, always make sure you keep us in the loop. We can help you quarterback your incident, and we can work with you when you eventually do have to contact NYS ED as well. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Fink, Director of Technology from the Freeport School District. I just had a follow-up question regarding the EdLaw paperwork and how we as school districts can hold the vendors themselves accountable for what they sign in the paperwork. And I guess just like how that would play out if there were a breach and a lawsuit were to happen. Because I certainly go back and forth with vendors when they send me, EdLaw paperwork that isn't complete enough or is vague. But I just, any kind of information you give me to enlighten me on how I can ensure that they're doing what they're saying they're doing beyond them just, saying they're doing it would be very helpful.
Well, I know what I like to tell places is that shop around if they are a sole source, and also don't pay them. They're not meeting their agreements. I've had other places, healthcare companies, technology companies, where I've literally told vendors, we're withholding your payment because you're not meeting your end of the contract. They pretty much fill out what they need to pretty fast when they know they're not going to get paid. That's where I talk about owning the relationship. They own their relationships now, and I know it's tough to do to turn that around. But very slowly, you have to start telling them, I pay for your service that you're providing me. There are other vendors out there. I will actively go seek those, And I know it's a mind shift, and it's a culture change, again, that I talk about, but it has to be done.
Well, I definitely already do that, and I would say probably the school districts already are doing that. The question is, we're like Cami, to get them on the phone, I have to talk to them at like 7 or 8 o'clock at night, like they are like in New Zealand, like for the most part. How do I make sure what they're putting on the paperwork is true? Because like, sir, they can say whatever they want. I can say this is what it needs to say. I certainly have, stopped going with people. How, if I'm accountable for that, or we are as school districts, what does that look like? Like, how they're saying my server is up to date, running this. How do I do that?
So normally, what we would say is for any vendor that has some kind of cloud services or software services, we require them to have some kind of internal audit report, whether it be a SOC 2 Type 2 report, or otherwise, that annually checks their controls. And one of those controls based on the COSO framework is their patching and updating of software. So that goes back to the SOC 2 reports. Hopefully they're doing it. If they're not doing it, then what kind of vendor are some of these vendors? That's where I get so annoyed at these vendors. You have enough money to take all my money, but you won't do a SOC 2 report to make me comfortable that I'm using you. See which vendors that you don't get them from, and then those are your delta, and then those are the ones you can really focus on getting tougher with.
Yeah, I mean, what I would tell you is along the same lines of what Joe just said, which is you have these requirements, they're in your contract. You ask them, don't take them at their word for the compliance, right? They're supposed to do internal reviews of themselves every year. I want to see that report. The second you ask for it, and they don't have it, first of all, they've breached their contract. They are now in breach. And they know that they've breached. And this presents a problem for them because you can withhold payment, and they can sue you for it. But I can tell you as a lawyer, if I walked into court, and I often do, with a school that says, yes, we withheld payment because these guys breached their contract and therefore compromised the data security of my entire district, I'm totally fine with that being my position in court, even if I lose, because I can justify that to anyone who's watching. And there are people watching those things, right? But you can push them on their contract compliance just by asking for the report, because they either did it or they didn't. If they didn't do it, they're in breach. Now that gives you a little bit more, you're sort of pulling back. Now, the flip side of that is, I totally get it. There are a limited number of vendors. I know that there are a lot of people that do things. There's only a certain number that do specialty items, things that you really need, and you don't want to not be in a position to provide services to students, right? That's the big, the flip side of saying get tough is you might not have the service that you need to provide to a student who really needs it. So you have to balance that. You have to do the best that you can do to get the compliance. I think sometimes it's just the simple things like pushing them for their reporting, pushing them for the information. Great, you use this program. Can you give me the supporting documentation for the program? Ask them for the basics, the things that everybody would have because they have access to it. That'll tell you if they can't give it to you or won't, there's your answer. And you've done nothing more than just ask for basic paperwork. It's an innocuous question, by the way, too. Sometimes I'll ask people, hey, can you just give me the supporting paperwork? I just need to have it for the file. I'm not asking because I want it for the file. I'm asking for a reason. But they may not pick up on it. Right?
Great response. Thanks,
Right, you have
Matt.
to be very clear with them.
All right. I actually want to move that over to David Faverio. David, you're not on a contract. You are not on a BOCES contract or a RIC contract, and in many instances, your organization does not necessarily charge for services. In fact, you're offsetting the cost of what it is you do for school districts. So in a situation like that, what type of certifications could you give to a district to make them feel more at ease working with you as a third-party vendor?
So obviously the biggest thing I can give you is our NAID certification. An independent international body has certified that we are doing the right thing when it comes to data destruction. And for you districts, if you want to start doing data destruction the right way, if you're not doing it already, NAID, just Google them. They have a website. You can find all NAID certified data destruction companies within a radius of where you are. So it's very easy to reach out and find them. And you could also check the certification status if the company is still certified or when their certification is running out to make sure that they're going to renew at the right time.
Hi everybody, my name is Brian Busto from Stetson Cyber Group. Good to see y'all. So I just want to go touch on one thing when it comes to the vendors again. So obviously, as it was mentioned, you can't analyze the vendor systems. You can't go in there and do your own assessment. So you have to at least perform the most diligence you can do. And outside of the paperwork being filled in, there are some really nice extensive checklists that you can send to them and go into pretty good detail of what their systems requirements are, how those systems are handled, how they're patched, what compliances they have in place. And those type of documents, which are really simple to implement and get going, can really put a lot of information in your hands. And the goal in the end would be to kind of classify those vendors and have them in some sort of a risk category for you to know who are the higher risk ones and how do you handle the higher risk ones. There may be some different depth and defense model types of systems put around their systems, or there are a lot of different things you can look at, and vendor by vendor, it's going to be a different relationship that you're going to have, and there are going to be different ways of managing that relationship. But as long as you're doing your due diligence on that vendor, that really goes a long way. So if something does happen, that's going to help you in the end.
And I want to add something about that with the vendors. So as someone who's worked with vendor contracts for almost 20 years, there is also, you could put in your contracts a right to audit clause. And if you wanted to, and they sign that contract, you have every right to audit those vendors if it's in the contract. So if you're creating the contracts that the vendor has to sign, and you have that clause in there, execute it. I mean, work with someone to execute it, or even threaten them with the fact, hey, I want to put you on my audit plan for next year. You could do that. I've done that with other companies in the past, and I've actually, as the internal auditor, said, all right, I'm coming to audit your company now. Go show me everything you got. You can do that.
You can also always blame your auditors, because that always works.
I'm great at getting blamed. I get blamed for everything.
And I always live by the rule, whoever's in charge is ultimately responsible. Sorry, superintendents. Because, if you're the supervisor, like if somebody who works for a supervisor makes a mistake, who's ultimately responsible? The supervisor, right? Because it's their show. So there is a lot of onus on a superintendent, and there is a lot of onus on a school board. The DPO is there to manage all this for you, to try to ensure that you have the right communication circles when stuff like this occurs. And they need support. And for anyone who's here who gets to make decisions about who's appointed your data protection officer, please understand it is a full-time job that is often given to someone who already had the job. And they're supposed to be overseeing all your data governance for your whole district. And that means every person who works in the district, including the cabinet members of your district. In addition, if a tech director is your data protection officer, how do they oversee themselves? Right? You don't need technical knowledge to be a data protection officer. You need really good project management skills and really good people skills. And you need to know the federal and state laws that govern student data privacy. That's what you need to know. But you don't necessarily need to be technical. You need to work with the technical people to make sure that they're securing your network and protecting your data. Different. So that's my soapbox about data protection officers. They should be looped into all these conversations. That's what I'm going to say.
And from a communication standpoint, if there are changes that are being made throughout the district, that has to be communicated or updated, and without policies and procedures that are reviewed annually, those things are never updated. So if that communication did go out and it went out to, say, a dead email or the wrong person, then that information wouldn't flow down. Not saying that happened in your school district, but these are kind of things that you have to look for.
Typically, when we go into an organization, the person who's in charge of what you're saying, I sit with immediately and say, what % of your day or time is spent doing this? in the beginning when you first started this, and where are you now? And it starts at like 70, 80%, and now they're like 10, 15%, because they're doing all these other things that you're talking about. And I know we got very granular into one particular thing, but there are ways to set up inside your system, lack of a better word, canaries. We set up canaries where if something happens, it alerts us at this one spot. It's isolated. We know what happened. We can contain it there, and then we can disseminate it to the people who need to know it. But it's not weak spots, but it's a spot where if somebody were to come in, this is where it's going. So if you can set that and things like that up, and again, it's being proactive to saying this may happen to me. It's commonplace, but more importantly, the person you're talking about, their shift on percentage of their day is flipped, and now all of a sudden things fall through the cracks because you're asking too much of that one person. Just I feel bad for I'm sure your day is doing something completely different and when you started, you're probably doing more of what you're supposed to be doing. Right? And that's what we all see across the board. You have to find somebody else to take on that technical IT side of it.
Yeah, we see it in a lot of districts where the DPO is really inundated with their day job and their DPO job, and it's heartbreaking because they really want to do the right thing and they don't have the time to constantly do that because one might be a director of science or one might be instructional technology, whatever the case might be, and they're trying to get the operations going all day long. And you can't really, DPO is a full-time job, as Laura said, and cybersecurity is a full-time job, and information security and data privacy, these are all full-time jobs that are falling on other people in these districts, and they just don't have a full-time job to do that.
We discussed the last time of possibly setting up a list, because that email can get missed from a vendor, either through a BOCES or the state. Here, there's been a breach or there's been an incident with a particular program, and we could check that weekly to make it simple. Like I said, I received mine on a Friday at 3:30 an email, but sometimes you receive 15 emails from that vendor per day on just reporting, and you accidentally didn't read that one as quickly because it's my daily 15 emails from that vendor, and that's where it was kept. That's where the email came in. So having that, something as important as our pay information, be on a list maintained by whoever, I think would all gladly pay $1,000 a year for BOCES or the state to do that for us. And we check it once a week to make it simple. Again, my goal is to make it easier instead of all of us doing the same thing over and over and over. With the OptiGate, a friend of mine called me and asked a question, except sent an email. I called her instantly and said, yours is still plugged in? She didn't know. I said, hang up the phone, unplug it right now, and then we'll talk after. Just trying to make it simple. We all can't be doing the same thing.
Just to add to that, one thing we have close to that is if your data privacy security service, we have the RIC1 DPSS listserv. So if there are major vulnerabilities that are being exploited in the wild, we will send them out if it impacts K-12. Yes.
Sometimes I get 15 from you guys. So just that list, I go to the website, would make my life so much easier.
We can look at, there is, by the way, all of the things we send out are archived on the RIC1 DPSS website. So you can see them all in one place.
Here's what's been breached.
Yeah.
That's the list. I think all.
Do you sign up for the MS ISAC alerts?
Again, like probably 4 today. So that's just, it's, and then you miss that one. And again,
they
just
do
a list.
keep a page for all the vulnerabilities they send out, and that is a list. It's like a spreadsheet. So that is someplace you can go, always.
Google has a vulnerability thing. Okay,
Yeah. It depends.
Yeah.
It depends. Some of them are more.
But we don't know the programs we use. We're using Cami and eSchool and Finance Matter. That's the list we're looking for.
Okay, I will bring that back to the work group.
Thank you very much.
If I might, the other thing in that regard is, and it was mentioned a couple times, but vendors, right? By and large, a lot of you are using the same vendors. Some of you may be vetting these vendors because maybe it's the first time you're using them. You vet them and say, oh, no way, not using this guy. This guy doesn't have multi-factor, he doesn't have encryption, no way. But somebody else is using it. Sharing information, while I understand that sometimes people don't want to share information because it may reflect poorly on them or the district that they're working for, but the reality is the more information you share amongst yourselves about vendors, right? Somebody was doing fine, but they it's time to renew their contract, and I vetted them when I renewed the contract and realized there's a major problem. I know 3 other districts that are using this vendor, but I choose not to tell them because that's their problem. That's probably not a good way to do things, because it's just going to lead to information, potential problems elsewhere, and you could have done something. All you have to do is send an email, right? So sharing that information is useful. It is valuable. Understand that while I'm the lawyer and I may know things, but I can't share with other people all the time, not unless you tell me I can. And so that's an extra layer sometimes. So I may know that there's a problem with a particular vendor, but I may not always be able to share that information or where I got it because of things like privilege. So I would encourage all of you to share amongst yourselves information, particularly critical things like, hey, we know there's a problem or some risk with this particular software, don't use it, right? I get what you're saying, right? A centralized system for that is really valuable, but I would also encourage people to be proactive about sharing that information amongst themselves. I know that there is some of that, but there's not enough of it.
Well, look at it from a personal perspective as well. Say I am working in Huntington, but I live in Hempstead, or vice versa. If I'm not sharing that information with the other school district, I'm affected as much as that other district is, right? So, how many here work in the district that they live in? I don't think everybody does. So one of the other districts is going to get breached or hacked from a bad vendor, you're getting affected. So take it personal as well. Your information is going to be out there.
So I'm a vendor, or my company is a vendor. I'm the Chief Information Officer of Suffolk Transportation Service. We service 23 plus school districts, Suffolk County Transit. This has been top of mind for us for quite a while. Cybersecurity has been top of mind for us for several years. So one of the things, and I wanted to give you our view on our side of the desk of what we see coming toward us constantly, are districts that are asking for this information, but in many different forms. So it would be very nice if there was a standardized form that asked us how we comply, what we're doing, how we're doing it. Instead, we're getting from 6, 7 different districts, 6 or 7 different ways of asking us similar questions. So that would be a comment. The next thing is a question. It's probably more for Matt. So we're a vendor, but we also have vendors that work for us.
Right.
And they have access to the PII.
Right.
An example would be our routing system.
Right.
We have a very sophisticated routing system. We have a very sophisticated GPS telematics system, which provides parents with, the parent app, where's the bus, when will it be there? So there's this big circle of where this data swirls inside and outside of our organization. So we're tasked right now with having the sub-vendor, if you will, or some of you in your questions call it subcontractors, and that gets into a whole different legal discussion. But right now, we're ensuring that our sub-vendors are in compliance. The question is the sub-vendor, let's say it's the routing software company that we're using, they have access to the data. Should they be entering into an agreement with us or with the district directly?
I would say that they need to enter into an agreement with you. You're the one entering into the contract with the district, because they're not providing direct service to the district. They're providing it to you. You are then providing a larger service to the district. So it is district with you with the sub, in this case the routing system provider, but you need to ensure that in your contract you are incorporating your obligations to the district into that sub is absolutely 100% obligated to ensure the same level of data security that you provide to the district. So, and they can, in the same ways we said, hey, the district, get tough with your vendor. It's the same concept. It's just a different. So I'm not sure which one it is.
That's this. Sorry. So part B to that question is, if we've been in an agreement with a vendor, a sub-vendor in this case, for a few years. That contract was made a few years ago, and none of this is in that contract. Are we legally able to go back and say, hey, we need you now to amend our initial contract and be in compliance?
So I think the answer is, well, yes.
Thank you for your question.
In terms of whether you are obligated to, the answer is yes. Can you? Absolutely. I would imagine, I haven't even seen the contract you're talking about, but I would imagine that there is a provision in that contract that says something about the parties doing anything and everything to comply with all applicable laws, because that's a general catch-all in most, commercial contracts. This is a change in the law that came into effect after the existence of the agreement, and you now need to amend the contract in order to provide specifically for this change in the law. And I would bet that you have provisions in there that allow you to do that. If the sub doesn't want to do that, the first question I always ask, because I've had these situations come up, and the first question I ask the subcontractor's lawyer is, so is there a reason you don't want to include a provision to comply with the law in your contract? That usually leads to, well, no, that's not what I was saying, and a lot of stammering, and then you get it done. But yeah, you do need to include that, because you have to have a specific provision in there about this.
So let me ask, what do you provide to school districts? What do you have to evidence that your information systems have the proper controls and they're working? So what do you provide to your clients that you have proper controls in place?
Well, each of them has a different. That's
right. Everybody's asking for different things.
Regardless of that, so just the actual question is: do you do a SOC 2 Type 2? Do you do anything like that, or do you have anything?
Provide whatever they need.
Okay.
If they ask for it, but in most cases, it's a survey, and it's like from 1 to 7. Where do you rank yourselves?
That's the supplemental information.
So I didn't want to go down the rabbit hole with the SOC 2s because I think they're a good tool. So over the course of the years, what's happened is a lot of companies, I'm not going to talk about school districts because I've never gone this far down the hole with them yet. But what they will do is SOC 2 Type 2 reports will also list out the subcontractors that vendor uses, no matter who they are, the whole list of them. And then it's up to the client to determine with the vendor which of those subcontractors are being used as part of the contract. And then it's really up to them to also determine to make sure that the vendor, you, are making sure that those sub-vendors are complying with whatever that company needs. So that's what, it's all part of the vendor management program, and as a mature program happens, and I'm hoping that as I work with more school districts, this is going to happen, that the subcontractors are going to be required to have the same type of security controls as the regular vendor, as the main vendor or contractor. So it's been happening for years in these bigger companies. So districts are really going to have to start looking at that as well.
To go into that further, everybody hears that Walmart won't work with mom and pop companies, right? And it's because of this exactly. It's this exact moment. And me being an MSP, I'm on both sides. I represent schools and all this. And then I have the vendors like you, where you look at it and go, I don't know how to answer all these questions, and which way does it go? I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I want to be compliant. It's a matter of making sure your IT person, whoever's internally, is leaning into, I guess, your sub-vendors, answering questions. But then, law firms are coming to me saying, hey, I have this vendor, because we've talked about vendors as if they're the boogeyman, right? Like, vendors want to do the right thing, right? We haven't talked about vendors sitting with their lawyers going, I want to make sure I'm the shining star in this industry. How do I do this? So I've had lawyers come to me saying, hey, here's a company that's working with Bank of America, PepsiCo, whatever it may be. That's who you guys are as school districts. You're the Walmarts. You have the power to lean into them and say, hey, this is what we need to move forward. And once you start doing that, the vendors want to do the right thing. They're not trying to get away from stuff. They've just never been asked. That's the bigger part. You said it 3 times.
Well, that's it. We have that power also.
Yeah.
With our sub, because we're a large
right. But you want to do the right thing, and you say, I just
they'll be
want one
happy to give it to
compliant.
us. We just need to know what you want.
Exactly. So asking your vendor is not a scary thing. It's just that you have to ask because nobody's doing it, but you are the Walmarts. You know, you guys are the ones that can lead into them and say, this is what we need, and then they do it. You know, they're going to do it. And if they don't, typically, like, you know, like Matthew said, it's for a reason, you know. Sometimes I don't want to comply. There's a bigger thing you need here. You need to look other ways out.
And a lot of vendors, if they're really proactive, as you say you are, will give more than what's being asked for anyways, and say, listen, I can give you whatever you need. Here's everything. You know, we are complying with everything. Just, you know, take everything just to prove that you're, you know, without having to say, oh, the school district wants this or this one. Just give them everything. That would be my recommendation. Give them the best report that you have, or whatever internal audit report, or your due diligence that you're doing, and provide it.
Interestingly enough, I would say we've done that with a few districts, and they have said to us, we're not interested in your report, just answer our question.
Well, that's that's again a culture and a learning shift that has to come down with the new EdLaw 2D, and we're getting there.
You have to answer the questions because they need to post that.
I get it.
And then
I
in
totally
addition,
get it.
just throw them the report.
Yeah, just throw, yeah, right, exactly. Throw them, just add
Give
it.
them the report anyway.
As long as, listen, whatever they do with it, but give it to them. Yeah. They can give it to me and I'll read it for them. That's fine. Just give them the reports.
Bob Vecchio again. I've spent 30 years in healthcare prior to taking on the role I have now, and hearing all this reminds me of the conversation 25 years ago when HIPAA laws came out. And I'm wondering if there should be collaboration with their counterparts in the healthcare field, because getting to your question, that harps back to linkage agreements that we were forced to have with our subcontractors or our vendors to make sure PHI was protected, and we were in the substance use field and we had 42 CFR for confidentiality. So I'm wondering if collaboration with the healthcare counterparts in IT and legal agreements with vendors, because they've been doing this for a long time now. HIPAA is nothing new. My question for the lawyer, though, thinking of the marriage between HIPAA and EdLaw 2D, is there any inherent conflicts when you're dealing with medical information for students for HIPAA compliance and EdLaw 2D? Are there any inherent conflicts that schools need to be aware of with regards to the new law?
So, inherent conflicts between the two statutes? I mean, I would say nothing inherent that I've seen. I always err on the side of everything is you want to withhold. So HIPAA, in terms of protecting, you're trying to protect the same basic categories of information. My general tact is that I have always thought EdLaw 2D is a little bit more expansive in terms of who it applies to. They've made it a little bit more broad in terms of who has an obligation than I think HIPAA does. But that's because HIPAA very clearly defines it only applies to providers as opposed to anyone who might have access to information. So for instance, the easiest way I can explain that is I have medical information about an individual because I have a personnel file and it has medical information. I'm not covered by HIPAA, even if my client may be. So I don't have the HIPAA problem, but maybe I have a 2D problem if it's a school that gave me, right? So I've always interpreted that as 2D's design is to apply to more people who are covered, but that's it. In terms of conflict, I don't think there's much in the way of conflict at all. That said, I know HIPAA, but not in the, in sort of the nuts and bolts. I mean, I just have enough to, but based on what I know, I'd say no.
I think at the end of the day, they're both in place really to protect data. I've worked for health insurance companies where they've also had the model audit rule, which is also another, in effect, protecting data and privacy. It's just, no matter what it is, it's just protecting data, whether it be PHI, PII, IEP information for the schools. It's the same basis just for everybody involved, whoever's covered.
Robert Hines, Riverhead Schools Director of Technology. My question is about liability. So we do provide training for all of our teachers and our staff. We have them sign an acceptable use policy. But if one of those teachers or an advisor for a club were to use software that ended up in a breach that was not EdLaw 2D compliant for the district? In that situation, would the liability fall on the teacher or advisor, or would that fall on the district still in that situation?
Great question.
Okay, so okay, so we have a vendor who has engaged. Yeah, I mean, the vendor, yes, they have a problem. I think 2D doesn't impose, I think, any real liability on individual employees. It's an entity-based liability. So the district's obligation there is to ensure that its people are doing what they're supposed to do. And so any kind of violation committed by any employee is going to fall on the district. There's no real, as opposed to civil liability where someone, right, I'm acting, right, I'm a teacher, the best way I can describe it is you have a number of individuals being sued under the Child Victims Act, because I assume everybody knows what the Child Victims Act is here. And they sue an individual, and one of the defenses is that they were acting outside the scope of their employment, right? And that's how I can, as a district, avoid the civil liability. That doesn't carry any water here. If a district employee engages in some sort of conduct, then the district's on the hook. It doesn't matter that it might have been outside the scope. The district should have done something to prevent it. That's the way it's going to be looked at in terms of how SED, how any state agency is going to look at that, and then forget what the public, right? Because again, public entity, we have folks who we answer to. They're going to look at it a completely different way, which is probably more along the lines of, why didn't you stop this? So I think, that's how it's a little different. It's more like what we call strict liability than the concepts that I would use to defend a district in a civil suit.
And just from a non-legal perspective to help the districts out, when you don't have policies and procedures documented and enforced to specifically say that you're not supposed to be downloading or using software that's not authorized by the district, and then you communicate that policy and they're aware of those policies and they break policy, I mean, from a non-legal perspective, and I'll let Matt talk about it, but that's on the employee.
Right, and I'm curious too, because from an audit perspective, that's a standard question that we're asking. You want to make sure that people don't have local admin rights to be able to do that. So how do they?
For instance, if you have an esports program and using Discord, for instance, it's not something the district condones. There's no EdLaw 2D compliant.
But they're using it on district property. They're using it on district resources.
Right. You have an obligation as a district to know what's on your system. Anybody. So if you have an employee, I presume you have a policy that tells people not to do those sorts of things. The question becomes, okay, now they did it. Well, you should have known that they did it because you're keeping an accurate sort of call it inventory, whatever, but you're keeping an accurate track of what's on your system and what's accessing it. And the second you see that, you should shut it down. If you don't, that's on the district.
But there's so many web-based applications.
Website.
Right. You control that and categorize as an educational site in your firewall.
Nobody has programming.
If it's a web-based application, how do we control that? No one's sitting
on a network.
and sifting through millions of firewall logs on a daily basis to see if someone is entering in any type of.
And that's why your policy and procedures really help in enforcing those and really putting that word out constantly. And listen, my wife's a teacher. I get it. I have to tell her multiple times of certain things that they shouldn't be doing in the school district. But with the policy and procedures,
we're not going to mention what district that is.
No, we're not going to mention that district that is. But if you constantly remind them, I think that humans are visual creatures, and if you just say, hey, there's an unwritten rule that you can't do this, they're going to do it because there's no enforcement on that. But if you have it in black and white and it's a enforced policy, at least you have some kind of recourse.
Right. Audience members, we are approaching 5 after 10, and I just want to be very cognizant of time. My last question actually is for all of you. Assuming you are just one or two persons representing your district or your private organization here today, I'd like you to let our panelists know, how can we best educate your board members, your school board members, your district, your private entity or organization? How can they they best share this information that was shared with you today? Anyone?
Reach out to me, we'll set up a webinar for Nassau Suffolk School Board members. I'd be more than happy to do that. I've spoken with Brian about it. We did a seminar last January. As a matter of fact, it was a two-part seminar with an internal audit firm, the Rocky Smith, talking about EdLaw 2D. I know Bond, Shonik and King law firm has put out papers and stuff like that. So with Pupfish, and I'm working with Stetson and Gershio. Gershio, I'd love to talk to you, and Serini and Associates.
Great. Would that be helpful for the rest of you?
Yep.
Something similar to that, because that's certainly something that our panelists are more than happy to do.
Yeah, we talk to board members after doing risk assessments. We offer our school districts, if they have problems, if they want to explain something to the board that they may not get, that has to be implemented. We are very happy to explain why it's important and why it's part of EdLaw 2D.
Because we can sit here and do panel after panel and info session after info session every few months, but when we see the same faces in the room, we know that the education has to get further. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, so I'm Joseph Eckstein. I'm with Eastern Suffolk BOCES. I'm the data protection officer there. To answer your question, from my perspective, I couldn't see any better way to get this information in front of a board if it came from the district's attorney, counsel, Gershio and Gershio, to the board to suggest that at one of the upcoming board meetings, they entertain a 20-minute, 30-minute informational speaking engagement where a panel like this comes and speaks. I can't see how internally I could ever have that kind of an impact. But if it came from our lawyers and they suggested it, and then you set up a meeting at a board, that would have an incredible impact.
Matt, you have homework.
Thank you very much.
I think a budget ask from the bottom up and making it a budget priority, because board members are always looking at the budget impact, right? We have to look at the investment necessary. So your input from a budget ask, even if it's never been asked or it's an amount that you're afraid to kick up to the top, that's the important thing. You know, Sharmi's Desire here, she's a board trustee over in Uniondale. We have these conversations all the time. The other suggestion I would make is the state association does an annual convention. You guys have probably entertained this. Do a presentation at a statewide convention as well, because again, getting in front of the governance teams, we're doing presentations at the superintendents association's conferences that they do statewide or locally is the other thing. Yes, getting in front of the governance teams are extremely important, because as a board member, and I spent 18 years in that seat, 15 as board president, these are the things that worry us at night. You know, the breach, the ransomware attacks, how do we avoid it? We don't want to micromanage it. We want to make sure that you have the proper resources to do it. And again, getting back to the adage, it's expensive to be cheap. You know, I may save $10,000 here, but if my phone systems go down and there's police activity in the community and parents can't call our school to find out what's going on, I have a crisis within a crisis that could have been avoided if I took care of the infrastructure. So,
Panelists, and I thank all of you for your participation here today. I applaud every person in this room for being here today in an effort to do your part to reduce the risk of a catastrophic cyber attack. So thank you so much for being here today, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you, panelists.